Imagine yourself on a journey into a wondrous and magical place. We're heading for the land of fantasy. Today, fantasy has become a worldwide phenomenon. In the 21st century, more and more people are turning to books, movies, and video games to transport them into the worlds of the imagination. But is this explosion in fantasy simply an entertainment? A way of hiding away from the realities of our modern world? Or is it something more?
Fantasy isn't escapist. It's a way of dealing with the most serious issues of the century. That's why it's been popular.
The best fantasy is always a distorted lens of reality. It is where people see the same old world made glorious. It's like turning the lights on.
This is the story of how fantasy grew into being the biggest thing in our modern culture, of how its magic reflects our everyday lives and confronts our darkest fears. These people may look like they are simply playing a strange kind of game, but in their minds they've been transported into a fantastical realm, the Discworld.
Brilliant constellations shone down on the Discworld. One by one the traders shuttered their shops. One by one the gone-offs, thieves, fine wirers, whores, illusionists, backsliders and second-story men awoke and breakfasted. Wizards went about their polydimensional affairs.
Like all the greatest fantasy creations, Discworld is a world both very much like our own, yet completely different to it. There are banks, universities, and newspapers, but there are also elves, wizards, walking suitcases. Oh, and the earth there is flat. Discworld was created not by some omniscient god, but by a bearded man living in the English countryside. His name is Terry Pratchett.
Terry Pratchett is one of the key writers of the late 20th century, early 21st century. He publishes a hardback, it goes straight into the top 10, and it stays there.
Terry's quite remarkable. It's that weird combination of elegant writer, bomb-throwing satirist, and cheap and sniggering jokester, I think that makes Terry absolutely unique.
In just over 20 years, Pratchett has written 36 Discworld books that have sold in excess of 43 million copies worldwide, making him one of the most successful authors on our own humble planet. It has also made Discworld one of the most visited places in the universe of the imagination.
The fact that somehow we can recognise something of our society in Discworld, I think, gives Discworld its power, because you can see it's not exactly made up, or rather it is made up by taking what we see around us and stirring it up differently and spicing it and presenting it from a different light. And in fact, G.K. Chesterton famously said that fantasy is the art of taking the everyday, which we don't see anymore, and turning it around and showing it to us from a new direction. So we, as it were, see it again for the first time and think, oh, I never looked at it like that before.
I can remember when most every night at 10 we sang an old refrain as we wandered in the moon.
Terry Pratchett's rise to publishing sensation is also the story of the rise of fantasy itself. It starts in post-war suburban Britain in the late 1950s. In literature, the angry young men were reflecting the times with kitchen sink dramas and novels about the harsh realities of real life. But from an early age, the young Terry Pratchett was captivated by the magical possibilities that fantasy could offer.
I don't recall learning to read for pleasure at school. The first book I ever read for pleasure was The Wind in the Willows. I read it all the way through and read it again and joined the local library within a couple of days. Was looking for other books, and I just wanted to get that magic. And I quickly got through all the fantasy that they had, which wasn't so much in those days. And the folklore, because that seemed pretty much like fantasy. And then the mythology, because that clearly was fantasy. And then the ancient history, which in many ways resembled the fantasy. And one book led to another book.
But the prime inspiration that would kickstart Pratchett's journey to literary giants was not an ancient mythic tale, but a modern saga, written by the grandfather of our modern fantasy boom, J.R.R. Tolkien.
With a little sniff, the librarian said to me, "These have just come in. I think you like this sort of thing." And it was Lord of the Rings. And I read that in 24 hours. I think I slept for 2 of the 24 hours with the book open in front of me, all the way through, and I read it again.
He led the way in under the huge branches of the trees. Old beyond guessing, they seemed. Great trailing beards of lichen hung from them, blowing and swaying in the breeze. Out of the shadows the hobbits peeped, gazing back down the slope. Little furtive figures in the dim light seemed like elf children in the deeps of time, peering out of the wild wood in wonder at their very first dawn.
I can remember sitting there in the middle of the carpet, and there were beech trees growing. I mean, I was in the middle of a wood. I actually remember it like that because the effect of that first reading of Lord of the Rings had on me. Middle-earth was there, vaguely like our Earth, but it wasn't. It was a different place.
Pratchett had fallen under Tolkien's spell. But to most readers in this period of rationing and rising crime rates, the trials and tribulations of orcs and hobbits could not have felt more baffling.
And people always like a certain amount of familiarity in their reading, which is why fantasy took so long to become a broad public form, which it is now. Tolkien was described as a post-nuclear disaster novel. People simply couldn't get their heads around it.
Tolkien's saga was a trilogy in search of the right audience. And as the post-war gloom gave way to the technicolor vibrancy of the 1960s, Lord of the Rings, and fantasy itself, started to make its mark.
The counterculture was kicking in. The hippies, decided, to Tolkien's horror, that these books were theirs and that they were speaking to them.
It coincided with people looking for different sorts of ways to view the world. And into this came this extraordinary epic tale. You had a generation of readers who, in a way, were almost looking for a Bible. And there it came.
Fantasy thrived in an underground scene of radical thinking, wild imagination, and the kind of drugs that made people want to befriend elves. Tolkien opened the door to a new world, and the beautiful people broke on through to the other side.
It was the thing that was nice about fantasy in those days. It was a sort of open field. It was like rock and roll, actually. You could do almost anything you wanted to do. There were no parameters. There was no body of learning, or very little. There were a few heroes, and that was about it. It was very surprising how many people read fantasy and did rock and roll.
Moorcock himself was at home in both worlds. By day, dreaming up new fantasy stories, but by night, a part-time member of the fantasy-inspired acid rock beast known as Hawkwind.
People were more optimistic then, you know, they were ready to believe in good things. Nowadays, everybody believes in bad things, seems to me. The first time I read Lord of the Rings was on my last year. I had to read it again later, you know.
Moorcock introduced the out-there sensibility of Hawkwind's music into fantasy writing, producing a sort of psychedelic sword and sorcery whose vivid imagery and moral ambiguity suited the age of Aquarius.
The dreaming city no longer dreamed in splendor. The tattered towers of Imra were blackened husks, tumbled rags of masonry standing sharp and dark against a sullen sky. Once, Elric's vengeance had brought fire to the city, and the fire had brought ruin. Streaks of cloud like sooty smoke whispered across the pulsing sun, so that the shouting, red-stained waters beyond Imra were soiled by shadow. And they seemed to become quieter, as if hushed by the black scars that rode across their ominous turbulence.
I think the drug culture liked what I did because they assumed I was doing it all on acid, and I was doing it all on coffee and sugar, really. Although I must say that I was no stranger to the odd psychedelic drug.
One of the key things that Moorcock was trying to do was move away from moralism in fantasy. And so in his writing about his great fantasy anti-hero Elric of Melniboné, the great binary is chaos and order or law. It's not good and evil. So what he was trying to do was to undercut that sense of finger-wagging, of kind of moral lessons that sometimes feels quite strong in fantasy.
Moorcock's anti-establishment fantasy came into a counterculture that had embraced Lord of the Rings, not as a moral tale about the evils of war, but as a best-selling radical manifesto.
It was almost like a Bible, that it could completely reflect the needs of the counterculture and the confusion of the 60s. Often when you have enormous cultural and social upheaval, there is that idea of looking for a leader. And oddly, in a funny sort of way, Tolkien through Lord of the Rings was one of those leaders, a father figure.
But it wasn't all simply turning on and dropping out amongst the hobbits and orcs. Good and evil were battling on planet Earth as much as Middle-earth. In an age of protest, Vietnam and the bomb, fantasy was already both an escape from reality and encouraging its audience to confront it.
Fantasy drinks from the vitality of a young audience and a young desire to say the world is not what is there. We can change it, or we can make it different, or we can view it in a different way. And that's essentially a really young perspective. You know, the narrator of it can be a wise old man, but the most of the people that embrace the fantasy genre are spiritually very young. And the people that reject it, I'm sorry to say, are senior citizens of the cultural world.
You can go to fantasy to escape the fact that you don't like the world. You want to go somewhere simpler. You want to go somewhere more straightforward. You want to go somewhere that's like you think the world should be.
Lord of the Rings propelled fantasy into a worldwide phenomenon. More and more people began to see Middle-earth as the ultimate trip. But once they left the Shire behind on page 1008, they were hungry for more. The snag was that Tolkien had put away his magic quill.
You started to get books published in the late 70s within the great tradition of J.R.R. Tolkien printed on them, which was the point at which publishers suddenly gone, you know, he's not going to write any more books. Why don't we just publish stuff kind of like that and make it look as close to that kind of stuff as you can? And suddenly that seemed to spawn a genre.
What you saw in fantasy publishing was what you see every time there appears to be a successful genre. The idea immediately kicks in that somehow, because it's genre, it's easy. So therefore, there are many, many people who think, I like reading fantasy, can't be that difficult, it's just making up a load of elves. I'm going to have a go. A lot of it was completely bonkers and not very good.
Fantasy was a damsel in distress, but it was about to be rescued by an unlikely Dark Knight who'd been honing his writing skills by turning out press releases as the head of public relations for the British nuclear power industry.
I got quite hyper in the job, and a way of relaxing at home was just to hit the old typewriter. The Hinkley Point affair, when I came back after a day dealing with that, I was so exhausted. But I sat and spent about 24 hours at the typewriter and did about a third of a book, just as a matter of unwinding. A lot more people were now openly reading fantasy, and it was appearing more and more on the bookshelves. And there was a lot of good stuff being done, and there was a lot of stuff which wasn't as good. I think in time it became known as EFP, or Excluded Fantasy Product, because it's not difficult to put together a fantasy novel off the shelf, really. You know, you pick your young hero or heroine and your Dark Lord and stuff, and tick off various boxes, and you can turn out a fantasy novel. And I decided just to have some fun with the cliches of the fantasy novel.
All eyes in the room were watching the stranger, except for a pair belonging to Rincewind, the wizard, who was sitting in the darkest corner nursing a mug of very small beer. He was watching the luggage. Watch Rincewind. Look at him, scrawny like most wizards, and clad in a dark red robe on which a few mystic sigils were embroidered in tarnished sequins. Some might have taken him for a mere apprentice enchanter who had run away from his master out of defiance, boredom, fear, and a lingering taste for heterosexuality. Yet around his neck was a chain bearing the bronze octagon that marked him as an alumnus of Unseen University, the high school of magic whose time and space transcendent campus is never precisely here or there.
Terry started off writing parodies of fantasy. His first book, Colour of Magic, was actually a parody of 4 perfectly identifiable authors. Any fantasy reader could tell you who they were: Tolkien, Fritz Leiber, Anne McCaffrey, and Robert E. Howard. I can see where they switched from one to the other. But then, of course, it stopped being a parody. It took off. It created its own world.
Where is the point where it all began?
Pratchett created a magical parallel world as fully realized as Tolkien's. He filled it with wizards, game-playing gods, and dragons who exist only if you believe they do, and put them on a flat earth which he called the Discworld.
Drifting onwards through space, atop 4 elephants, on the shell of a giant turtle, the great Artuin.
I would say to people that have never read Discworld that, well, it's possibly what Lord of the Rings might have become in 500 years' time. You know, the big battles are all over, the cities have grown, the trolls and the dwarves and the elves have, are now citizens by and large. Politics has taken the place of warfare, and everyone is chasing a dollar.
On one or 2 of Terry's books, there is a quote that says, Terry Pratchett is the greatest living satirist. He is our Jonathan Swift. And I think that's true. I mean, I think if one had to, boil Terry down to one thing in particular, I would probably say, yes, absolutely. In the parallel world that is the Discworld, he has the opportunity to be this incredible satirist of our own world.
Supposing an emperor was persuaded to wear a new suit of clothes, whose material was so fine that, to the common eye, The clothes weren't there. And suppose little boy pointed out this fact in a loud, clear voice. Then you have the story of the emperor who had no clothes. But if you knew a bit more, it would be story of the boy who got a well-deserved thrashing from his dad for being rude to royalty and was locked up.
Pratchett never hits the wrong tone. He's writing with such glee. And that kind of glee you don't at first realise is a function of genius. First you just think, oh, well, this is fun. And then you think, this is clever. And then you think, this is wise. He actually understands an enormous amount of things about how the world is.
Pratchett's early books were released into a world where fantasy was no longer a cult. He was poised to become one of the most widely read authors of our times. Huge audiences were engaging with fantasy like never before. For some, it was such a part of their lives that reading about gallant battles wasn't enough. They wanted to be in them.
19.
He's hit it. He's hit it. You get a very strong sense of evil.
Oh dear.
Coming
he jumps
from
back straight away.
Coming from this direction over here, running in a line down that way.
Inspired initially by Lord of the Rings, the fantasy role-playing game Dungeons & Dragons took sorcery, wizards and monsters off the page and turned living rooms and college dorms into magical kingdoms.
They're moving sort of...
My cleric will come forward with his holy symbol in his hand and command them, in the name of all that's good and just, to return and repent their evil ways.
Okay, roll 2/6.
What it does is take, I think, to the kind of logical end, the sense that a lot of fantasy readers have, which is that they're inhabiting the worlds they're reading about. And on one level, Dungeons & Dragons is nothing other than interactive fiction. You are working together with a group of other people, using dice and bits of paper, if you want, to tell a story about a group of people living in a fantasy world.
Okay, he's trying to get out.
This will he can strike a blow as he's retreating.
Yeah. Right.
It is immersive because you are using one of those characters as your own avatar, as your mouthpiece, as you exploring that world. So that's why I think there's such a strong overlap between fantasy readers and gamers, is it's that sense of wanting to inhabit it.
Actually, before you get there, this door bursts open and this figure comes storming through. He doesn't...
You actually become the character you're playing. Instead of saying that the character does so-and-so, you actually say I and mean it. I go to the door, I listen at the door. And when you are in extreme danger, you feel it and you get scared.
Now we've got it.
Role-playing games were pure escapism. But meanwhile, in the parallel world of planet Earth, fantasy writing's newly crowned master of the universe was finding reality to be the key that unlocked his imagination.
Stuff creeps in out of the ether into a book. Someone once said that you can tell what was going on politically 6 months ago by reading a Discworld book, because I'd have just been finished the book then, and bits of the news almost would creep into it.
With at least one and sometimes two new volumes every year, Discworld quickly grew into a complex and extensive fantasy saga. The parody nonsense world became a realm where great moral themes, politics, human relationships and war, were explored with a tongue stuck firmly in its cheek.
You can't arrest the commander of an army. Well, actually, Mr. Vimes, I think we could, said Carrot. And the army too. I mean, I don't see why we can't. We could charge them with behaviour likely to cause a breach of the peace, sir. I mean, that's what warfare is. Vimes's face split in a manic grin. I like it.
Within Discworld, because it's kind of modern in some ways, you can get lots of stuff in, which isn't classically the department of fantasy. For example, racial tensions, for example, political and religious tensions. And in some way, they get sufficiently diffused.
You need reality as the fertilizer of fantasy. I think Tolkien said you need to have a very firm world, a very firm reality to anchor one fantastic concept. And I agree that the balance between what we call reality and what we call fantasy has to be there. And brutality is part of it.
Pratchett's writing, like all great fantasy, spoke to its audience on many levels. It showed how fantasy's rising popularity was in its unique ability to reflect a troubled age with fairy tale and magic, while simply being readable as comforting otherworldly escape.
When I go to London, I'll go on the tube and you see all those people sitting there with their closed, drawn, weary faces. Half of them are reading a fantasy book. Now, you could say that's because it's sort of insulation from what's happening to them, but perhaps it's also telling them something about why they're there.
What is most interesting about writers of fantasy is that they do, it's almost like by stealth, address many of the very, very current issues that concern people. Recognizable emotions, politics, structures, hopes and desires, big epic issues, if you like.
Where does evil come from? How does it come back? How do we cope with things like, well, loss of faith? I don't mean to be offensive, but it's no good asking the Archbishop of Canterbury, and it's no use asking the Prime Minister. And yet there are people who want an answer. And I think that they get an insight into these matters from reading fantasy.
Fantasy can confront our deepest fears head-on, standing up to the biggest eternal questions of life. No theme is too big or too intense to be dressed up in a fantasy cloak. For Terry Pratchett, nothing is off limits, even the spectre of the end of life itself.
Who else could make death so hilarious? When death is asked by somebody if he thinks that when you die your whole life flashes before your eyes, and they go, yes, the process is called living.
It's one of the most brilliant things any modern writer has done. Most fantasies read by young people either sentimentalize death or pretend that it doesn't happen. And Pratchett has invented this character called Death, who knows perfectly well that he shouldn't interfere in human life, and knows perfectly well that he looks as he does because human beings have invented him in the form they want him to be in, which is a skeleton with a scythe and deep blue eyes that tunnel back into infinity. And Death obliges them by looking like they want him to look, and he obliges them by cutting them. Well, he cuts them down with a scythe because that is his function. And you get some quite nasty deaths in Pratchett.
Pratchett even made death the star of his own book, Mort. But a proposed Hollywood adaptation hit a stumbling block when the studio bosses became afraid of the Grim Reaper's presence.
It's about Death hiring an apprentice, and this kid who's no good at anything else is actually hired by Death, and his name is Mort, fortuitously.
And as Terry would put it, the red carpets were practically being laid, and then somebody said, at the head of some studio somewhere in America,
We really like this book if only you could lose the death angle.
we're not sure that the Midwest is ready for the character of Death.
But then that's Hollywood. You know, leave your brain on a hook by the door.
Death did finally make his grand entrance, though, in the first screen adaptation of Pratchett's work, Hogfather.
It's full of complex, difficult ideas and wonderful language. There's a most extraordinary speech at the end where Death explains to his granddaughter Susan his take, if you like, on the nature of being human.
Humans need fantasy to be human. To be the place where the falling angel meets the rising ape.
With tooth fairies, hogfathers.
Yes. As practice, you have to start out learning to believe the little lies.
So we can believe the big ones.
Yes. Justice, mercy, duty, that sort of thing.
And I remember having a very interesting discussion with our American financiers who said they won't like that in the Midwest. But we kept it in because it's actually the essence of that book, and it's the essence of Pratchett.
Flying saucers have invaded our planet. The whole world is under attack. Can it survive?
Whatever Hollywood's fears over a film about death may have been, fantasy cinema has never shied away from confronting the dark horrors of our world. However implausible the baddies might be, they have frequently been a reflection of some all too plausible terrors.
It's interesting that the flying saucer cult began in the very early days of the Cold War, when everyone was looking at the sky. You can map the aliens onto communists, you can map fairies onto flying saucer folk. We project our concerns up into the skies.
You're going to see the themes of fantasy echo the headlines. Just in the same way that Japanese monster movies were obviously a reaction to the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Then you get Godzilla and so on and so forth. It's all part of the same thing, and it's very obvious.
Many fantasy films are absolutely directly engaged with this very deep question, the origin of evil, the problem of evil. Sometimes, the allegory is quite a political allegory. I mean, Star Wars was famous in the 80s for being a kind of Reagan-esque vision of America, or of the mission of America, Pax Americana, on a sort of cosmic scale.
Long before Star Wars sent fantasy cinema's popularity into overdrive, films were giving audiences a captivating, otherworldly experience. Their unique magic has, for almost 100 years, been their ability to quite literally show us our world afresh.
Cinema is all fantasy. From the fact that we are projecting ghosts through a magic lantern, even if we're watching a Mike Leigh film that is trying to portray reality, it's evidently a fabrication. It's evidently something that is no more or is not there. It's like seeing the light of a star that died eons ago reach you.
Fantasy was intrinsically part of film from the beginning. Special effects began very early, and one of the first sets of films that began to be made by Hollywood were the Arabian Nights. There are lots of marvelous early special effects invented for The Thief of Baghdad.
Almost 100 years on, special effects have transformed how utterly fantastical cinema can be. Thanks to the huge advances in computer-generated imagery, there is nothing the imagination can conjure that can't be translated into celluloid. Even the great epic fantasy poem Beowulf, a 1,000-year-old story of dragons and underwater kingdoms, written down before the English language even existed, can now leap from page to screen.
The end of Beowulf, old Beowulf, is fighting a dragon. And I was going into the dragon fight, and I thought, I'm just going to put everything I can, throw everything in the kitchen sink in, and he's crashing against the cliffs, and he's trying to fight the dragon, and it's trying to shake him off, and now they're plunging under the water, and they bang into a shipwreck, and Grendel grabs this sunken anchor and plunges it into the dragon's lip and is pulled up, dangling from it. And I started thinking, I may be getting a bit carried away. And I phoned Zemeckis, the director, and I said, Bob, I started to tell him what I'd written and saying, look, I'm really concerned. I may be going rather, sending you over budget here. And there was a sigh from the other end of the phone. And Bob said, Neil, there's nothing you can possibly write that will cost me more than $1 million a minute to film. So don't worry about it.
Unsettling times produce unsettling fantasy. Among the darkest yet most celebrated fantasy cinema of recent years are the films of Mexican director Guillermo del Toro.
Hola. Hola.
His juxtaposition of enchanting worlds with brutal violence has shaken up and disturbed modern audiences, creating an experience somewhere between wonder and terror.
My imaginary world has always been incredibly unpleasant. And I think that some of the one of the sides of fantasy is that it can contain a lot of unpleasantness. You know, brutality, violence, sex are elements of fantasy necessarily because it's human endeavor.
Del Toro revels in fantasy's dark corners. A Hollywood studio offered to double the budget for Pan's Labyrinth if only he toned down the violence. He refused. An invitation to direct one of the Harry Potter franchise provoked a similar response.
One of the main components of a fantasy quest is it has to come with a prize. And much as I love the Harry Potter books, and I do love them, I felt at that stage on the third book, they were barely hinting at the dark places they were going to go to. I jokingly said to David Heyman, I said, when you need one of those kids killed, give me a call.
As a result of fantasy's current explosion, more and more people want to connect with the fantasy worlds that keep popping up like undiscovered planets. And just as technology in cinema has enabled them to see things that were previously inconceivable, so it can now give them the opportunity to become voyagers and explorers in these realms of the imagination.
I would love to urge people that are interested in the narrative arts to get involved in video games because they offer what I believe is the future, which is non-linear narrative.
They're movies. Increasingly, they are movies with the player as the hero or the heroine. And when you actually look at the quality of some of the modern ones, movies is not a bad description.
Fantasy computer gaming has been revolutionized since its beginnings in the early 1980s. Once the minority interest of small groups of button-pushing dungeon dwellers, online role-playing worlds are now visited by millions of people worldwide. The most popular of these games is World of Warcraft. In it, each player is transformed into a character, their avatar, in a virtual fantasy world.
I'm Kerry in the real world. My character in game is called Coppergirl.
Hey, I'm Ben in the real world. My character's name is Broctus.
They choose the avatar's name, species, clothing.
I'm Tom.
They can even change their gender.
My character's name is Fellaine.
Alone or in groups, they set out on the kind of quests in magical kingdoms that are familiar from decades of fantasy writing. Except here, the fates are in the player's hands.
There's a big difference between reading fantasy and interacting with a virtual fantasy world. Narrative is becoming more expansive. Stories have always been jumping off points for us to use our imagination. What's now happening with virtual worlds is the narrative becoming a jumping off point for people constructing stories together. People are engaging with the story and constructing their own stories on a level playing field with the traditional author.
I don't think a game is the same thing as a story. A game is a sort of open-ended thing, and it can end like this, or it can end like that, or it can fizzle out halfway through. This is where I'm a bit of a fascist. Reading is a democracy, but writing is tyranny. Writing is despotism. I am an autocrat when I write a story. I decide how it's going to end. I decide when this is going to happen, when that's going to happen. You don't. Nobody else does. I do. Games aren't like that. Games have to be open. They have to lend themselves to other people's input.
Games like World of Warcraft have created a kind of global democracy of fantasy. They've given all of us the chance to control worlds and shape destinies. But they've also blurred the line between the creators and the consumers of fantasy storytelling. Who gets slayed? You decide.
It doesn't matter how many times you watch Lord of the Rings, Frodo is never going to get pushed into Mount Doom by Sam. Now, really, Sam, you ought to push Frodo in there. Frodo deserves to be pushed in there. Nobody likes Frodo. Push him in the chasm. But no, every time, Frodo doesn't get pushed in this chasm. In the virtual world, whether he gets pushed down in the crack of doom or not is up to the players.
But Tolkien's saga is central to the history of modern fantasy. And 2007 saw the most recent development in what has become a vast Lord of the Rings industry.
The Lord of the Rings Online.
The 3-volume book, with its beginning, middle, and end, has become an infinitely variable online role-playing game. Millions of fans can now determine the fates of Middle-earth.
They've come here in a way because they like that mythology. They like the morality of that world that's been created. So how do you kind of help them not destroy the thing that they came here to love? Basically, we let you go into a specific part of the world and do things that there's no way you would get to do in other parts of the game. You know, I can go destroy a hobbit village, or I can, you know, be a very, very powerful troll and rampage across, you know, this Ettenmoors area and cause as much damage and mayhem as I want to. I mean, there's no way that I want to play a Lord of the Rings game and not be able to be an orc.
Online fantasy role-playing games can take years and hundreds of pounds in subscription charges to complete. But when they lure players into their grip, are they providing a comfort blanket from reality, or giving them a feeling of almost godlike power?
If you're going to play a virtual world for 3 or 4 hours every night, then answering the question, why are you playing this game, with the answer, fun, doesn't cut it. There's more to it than just fun. It's not just escapism. Why are you escaping? What are you escaping from? What are you trying to escape to? It's the first time ever in human history that regular, ordinary people can go away and become heroes without getting shot at or being incredibly rich.
Possibly the fantasy that is the sort of dangerous kind of fantasy is this fantasy that makes the protagonist the same as the reader or the same as the audience. And one of the reasons that I think that that's a danger is that it doesn't have this release effect of fantasy, this cathartic effect, because he will always be disappointed. When you return to the real world, you are not in charge.
This generation is experiencing something that I don't think generations have experienced for quite some time, which is that the world is in a very obvious place of chaos, and where evil is something that has a real face now, and where everyday life, you know, has the specter, the shadow of something really terrible happening to just about anyone, just about anywhere. The world is a dangerous place, and that there are people out there who do not see the world the same way that most of us do. And I think that makes this very appealing to people. It feels familiar to them, and then it's a story that in a very short amount of time you can succeed and defeat evil.
have been hideous times before in our history. At the same time, I do believe that the millennial thing has got something to do with it. There's been a feeling around for a few years now that we're at the end of something or at the beginning of something, or the world was going to end in the year 2000, or Jesus Christ was going to come down and sweep everyone off to heaven in a Cadillac or something. There's been this feeling of the end of things or the beginning of things, or a great change in things.
Fantasy was born out of ancient myths and legends, tales of trouble and strife that pitted good against bad. In our post-millennial 21st century world, little has changed. Global horrors like the attacks on America on September the 11th, 2001 have become defining landmarks in our history. They have thrown the huge moral issues that define fantasy, good and evil, faith, civilization, right into the heart of our everyday lives.
There's definitely surges in the pulse of fantasy at different times of political stress. When there are very strong problems of evil, for example, when people are very worried about what the reasons are that lie behind different conflicts, when the culprits are not, in a sense, entirely identifiable, then fantasy becomes a tool for thinking about that.
You can trace what's upsetting people, you can trace what's fascinating people by the things they're afraid of and by the things they dream about. The fantastic always seemed to me to be the perfect metaphor, the perfect way to talk about things that you needed to talk about.
In our new millennium, fantasy has taken on the task of addressing our fears and dreams. And as a result, fantasy and reality have become more inseparable than ever before. A new wave of writers have rejected the faraway lands, heroes, and mythical creatures that have been the bedrock of fantasy, choosing instead to construct parallel realities that mythologize and cast new light on brutal urban truths, such as homelessness.
She had been running for 4 days now, her harum-scarum stumbling flight through passages and tunnels. She was hungry and exhausted and more tired than a body could stand, and each successive door was proving harder to open. After 4 days of flight, she had found a hiding place, a tiny stone burrow under the world, where she would be safe, or so she prayed.
I can show people things they know. And I can give it a little twist. And it's not what they've seen before.
The Earl's Court train will be here in 10 minutes. Earl's Court isn't on the Central Line. Just stand over there.
You know, somebody who would never in a million years read a novel about homelessness on the streets of London will happily pick up Neverwhere and read it in a different way and learn things and take things away from it.
The rise of post-millennial urban fantasy has created a movement with a defiantly modern agenda, a movement that has been dubbed the New Weird. One of its leading lights is the young British author China Mieville, whose debut novel King Rat, a dark tale based on the Pied Piper of Hamelin myth, replaced fantasy as escapism with fantasy as shock.
They wove in and out of central London, climbing, creeping, moving behind houses and between them, over offices and under streets. Magic had entered Saul's life. It didn't matter anymore that he didn't understand. This was a million miles away from the tawdry world of conjuring tricks. His life was enthralled to another hex, a power which had crept into his police cell and claimed him. A dirty, raw magic, a spell that stank of piss. This was urban voodoo, fueled by the sacrifices of road deaths, of cats and dying people on the tarmac, an I-Ching of spilled and stolen groceries, a Kabbalah of road signs. Saul could feel King Rat watching him. He felt giddy with rude, secular energy.
King Rat represents a very gritty, urban London. There's no walking through the countryside and eating on magical bread given to you by elves. As Saul transforms into a rat, he finds himself rooting through bins and eating discarded food and loving it. And this is described with great love of the stench and the rot and the filth and the grime of a city. It's a very visceral approach to the city. It's about not denying the realities of who we are as human beings, that we have bodies, that we live in a city that doesn't work, that there is ruin and pollution everywhere. And it takes real joy in showing us this and reveling in these things that you're never going to find in Lothlorien. Tolkien famously said the function of fantasy is consolation. And I think Mieville has a real problem with that. Consolation is about making the world comfortable, about making it safe and secure. And what is the point of fiction if that's what it does? He wants to push against that. He wants to rub up against the fabric of history to challenge us and force us to re-engage with the world rather than withdraw into a kind of warm cup of tea that is the Shire.
The 21st century world of confusion and uncertainty that many contemporary fantasy writers choose as their setting is one where it seems almost anything goes. Fantasy no longer wants to console, but to challenge. In his novel, American Gods, Neil Gaiman created an epic tale set among the open highways of the American Midwest, a modern parable about the land of the free that addressed our modern society's loss of faith and wonder.
This was the moment of the storm. The paradigms were shifting. He could feel it. The old world, a world of infinite vastness and illimitable resources and future, was being confronted by something else, a web of energy, of opinions, of gulfs. People believe, thought Shadow. It's what people do. They believe. And then they will not take responsibility for their beliefs. They conjure things and do not trust the conjurations. People populate the darkness with ghosts, with gods, with electrons, with tales. People imagine and people believe, and it is that belief, that rock-solid belief, that makes things happen.
Fantasy is so many different things, and it's an incredibly flexible tool. I can use it in something like American Gods to discuss the nature of faith, post-religious things, the way that we've fallen off from faith, but what we've replaced it with, these strange modern gods, gods of computer and internet, gods of media, of television.
It's a really interesting one, whether there is a sense of fantasy dealing with the issue of us being in godless times. I think that there is a very real case to be made that authors such as Neil Gaiman are talking about how the lack of God, or the lack of a clear moral code that is shared by people, the lack of a collective moral conscience or religious conscience, is leading to people searching for something all of the time. At the same time as having this sort of sense of moral absence at the heart of things, that I think a lot of people feel, that there are no shared values. At the same time, you have the rise of fundamentalist religions in every part of religion.
We do need to believe there's something else. We need to believe that there's something eternal. Even the most existentialist, the most anti-social thinker, at one point in his life or her life, alone at night in bed for a few seconds, wonders if there are angels in the world.
As it hoovers up Academy Awards, literary prizes, and captures the enthusiasms and minds of millions, it seems fantasy has indeed taken over the world. By putting us in another place and setting free individual imagination, fantasy can be whatever we want it to be. Both a way to withdraw from the big bad world outside, or confront it head on.
I accept that it's a consolation. I will watch a good football match or a good tennis match, and I know it's in order not to think about the news. I know it's in order to have a narrative that is of no importance, in which I'm totally engrossed, and you come out of watching your match or reading your fantasy, and the problems that there were are still there.
But is this surge in the fantastic a temporary panacea for post-millennial tension? Just a phase we're going through? Or could it be the most contemporary manifestation of something timeless and vital that harks back to man's earliest myths and storytelling? The hunger for tales of mystery and imagination that tell us who we are and why we're here.
Storytelling is an intensely human need in all periods of history, all cultures, all faiths. If you look back, there are very obvious examples of fantastic tales going all the way back. People are bound together over decades and decades and decades by stories, even if their context, their age, their cultural background is completely different. And that's, I think, what really good fantasy does so brilliantly well. It says, we're all in this together.
The reason I think for the popularity of magic in fantasy is that magic gives us a direct connection with that which can't be explained. This also comes out in culture, in things like spirituality and religion. It gives us the feeling that we can actually harness the power of the unexplained. We can in some way affect the world in grand ways that we never could before. And ultimately, all of us want to fly.
Fantasy has been with us from the first moment we started articulating any conceit, any idea of the world, and will be with us until we as a race, as a species, die.
Next tonight, we're going to Vienna for another masterpiece, followed by a very special late edition live featuring guest Rory Bremner at 10:30.